Good evening. The Virginia Public Access Project and the Schar School of Policy and Government at George Mason University welcome you to After Virginia Votes. Tonight, we take a deeper look at the 2024 elections in Virginia. This live broadcast is presented by Walmart and made possible by our sponsors: Innova, Carillion Clinic, Northern Virginia Electric Cooperative, Northern Virginia Association of Realtors, Northern Virginia Chamber of Commerce, Centera, Town Bank, Jean Marie and Tom Davis, James W. Hazel, Joan Huffer and Rob Duggar, Nancy and Edward Rice, and viewers like you. Now, please welcome your host and moderator for this evening, NBC4 Northern Virginia Bureau Chief, Julie Carey.
And I want to welcome you again to After Virginia Votes. It is my distinct privilege to once again moderate this unique event sponsored by the nonpartisan Virginia Public Access Project. Now, the purpose of After Virginia Votes is to gain a deeper understanding of this year's federal elections in Virginia and to consider what the results say about Virginia and what they might mean for next year's gubernatorial election. We will focus most of our attention tonight on the presidential, U.S. Senate, and the competitive congressional elections in Virginia. I'm going to be joined by two seasoned political professionals who have agreed to leave their talking points at the door and engage in a candid conversation to give us a behind-the-scenes look into the tactics used in these races in Virginia. And then in the second part of the show, I'll be joined by two respected political analysts who will dissect the results and provide their insight on what this means for Virginia's political future. In each segment, we're going to save time for a few questions that have been submitted in advance through the online audience, and we'll see if we get any from our small audience here in the studio. You can also weigh in on the conversation on X using the hashtag #AfterVirginiaVotes. So before we get started, let's take a look at a handful of what I think are very interesting data visualizations prepared by VPAP that will help set the stage for our conversations today. We're going to begin with money in politics, specifically the race for president and the money raised, along with ad spending in Virginia. Now, this first visualization shows individual donations from Virginians to the presidential campaigns. This year started off in a dead heat, but eventually President Joe Biden began to slightly outraise Donald Trump in Virginia. Trump got a slight boost in May following his conviction in New York, but Biden maintained his advantage. Following the first presidential debate, the trajectory remained the same, but upon Biden's exit from the race and Harris's succession as the nominee, the Harris campaign saw a massive increase in donations from Virginians. Moving now to advertising. This next chart shows spending from the campaigns and outside groups who funded ads supporting or opposing the presidential candidates. Spending to support Vice President Harris slightly outpaced ads supporting former President Trump, but broke even the closer we got to Election Day. Republican ads picked up in the weeks before Election Day, while Harris ads consistently grew in the 2 months prior to the election. Let's now take a look at the early voting trends for 2024 and how they compare to the last presidential election in 2020. Starting with the trends for early in-person voting, we see that 2024's totals mirrored 2020 through that 45-day early voting period. However, early voting by mail was half of what it was in 2020, half. Now, while it's tempting to say that more people voted early by mail in 2020 due to the pandemic, the next chart tells a different story. Kamala Harris received more than 521,000 fewer early votes than Biden did. Harris made up some of that ground by having a higher turnout on Election Day, but that did not overcome the deficit from the early voting. Now, Donald Trump increased his share in all three voting methods. Turnout overall was down across the state, resulting in fewer than 70% of registered voters casting their ballots, and that's the lowest level we've seen in Virginia since 2004. When reviewing turnout in each county and city, we see that Republicans increased their share of votes in nearly every part of the state, with some of the biggest changes coming in Northern Virginia, specifically in Fairfax, Loudoun, and Prince William counties. Our next chart demonstrates this change when we split the localities between big urban, which are jurisdictions like Fairfax County and Virginia Beach, and suburban jurisdictions like Prince William and Loudoun. Democrats lost the biggest share of votes in these urban and suburban areas, while Republicans continue to grow their advantage in rural areas of the state. Senator Kaine received about 78,000 more votes than Vice President Harris to easily win re-election to the Senate over challenger Hung Cao. This visual demonstrates areas of the state where Senator Kaine outperformed Harris the most. And as you can see, Kaine's biggest gains over Harris's performance were in the southwestern part of the state. Finally, we look at the congressional elections. Virginia's most competitive districts going into this election year were congressional districts 2, 7, and 10. Now, both 7 and 10 were open seats after 10th District Congresswoman Jennifer Wexton announced her retirement due to health issues, and 7th District Congresswoman Spanberger announced her run for governor. Congresswoman Jen Kiggins ran for re-election in the 2nd District. State Senator John McGuire defeated incumbent Congressman Bob Good in the primary in District 5, and that remains a relatively safe seat for Republicans. A lot of money was raised in these congressional races, especially by Congressman-elect Eugene Vindman in the 7th. But in each case, as you can see, and as you know, the party who is in the seat prior to election maintains that seat in the next session of Congress. So, that is a look at our data. I'm going to be joined now by our first panel. Representing the Democrats tonight is Corinne Charles Dongo. She managed Senator Tim Kaine's re-election this year and is a senior member of his congressional staff. Her counterpart tonight, the Republican Party of Virginia's Executive Director, Ken Nunnenkamp. Thank you so much, both, for being here. It's going to be a fascinating conversation, so I'm eager to dive into the questions right now. I want to talk first about the top of the ticket change that we saw. We have never seen a presidential election year quite like this, when there was a shift at the top of the ticket with just three months before Election Day. Corinne, I want to start with you. Yeah. How did the shift from Joe Biden to Kamala Harris change things for Virginia Democrats? What adjustments had to be made in strategy, in message?
Yeah, I mean, first of all, thank you for having me. I think that the change, let me just step back a little bit. One of the things I advise in running an election is that you do have to plan for what you don't know. And I think in Virginia, one of the things we did, particularly in the senator's reelection, is work a ground game, because that helps us to really plan for what we don't know. So even in the midst of, after the first debate, in the angst after that debate, leading up to the change, we didn't stop doing events. The senator did not stop. We had events scheduled. We had our ground game going. And so we really continued that work. And I say that to say that we heard people on the doors, and we had answers for people on the doors. And the senator heard people at events, and he had answers for people at events. So when the ticket changed, it's as if we simply, as they would say, went with that flow, because we were already on a continuing trajectory of, we still have work to do in Virginia. We can't stop because national politics is being affected. So while, to succinctly answer your question, it affected voters in the sense of the Democratic worries, what will that mean for the possibility of a win? What we saw was it was a mostly positive effect. And I think what voters appreciated about Democratic leadership at the time, in Virginia in particular, is that the communication did not stop despite the changes that were happening.
Ken, before Harris led the ticket in Virginia, the Commonwealth was starting to look a little bit like a battleground again. In fact, I did a story about it. Yeah. I think the day after the debate between Donald Trump and Joe Biden. So, once that change happened, did Republicans instantly realize that the dynamic had changed, and then how did you readjust?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question, and I had to say, it was a question mark for a little bit, right? I think the first change we made was that we had to get rid of all the contrast literature that had Joe Biden's face on it. So that was the first thing we had to do. But to be honest, I think what it came down to was the vice president going to run on the president and her collective record? I think if she had distanced herself more, we would have seen a different strategy come to light on our side. But truthfully, she was running on the same record. So for us, the record we were messaging against didn't actually change much. I think the tactics didn't actually change much. And we did not see a lot of overhaul in strategy. It was a question mark for a while, but in the end of the day, I think we stuck the course.
And so you would say your messaging stayed essentially the same too, just substituting a different name.
Pretty much. I mean, I think even before then we were running against the Biden-Harris ticket. And so, then we were running against the Harris question mark ticket, then we were running against the Harris-Walz ticket. It wasn't actually much different on the messaging side. Honestly, it was more different on the name side than anything else.
And Kéren, before we leave that and go to talking about turnout some, I'm wondering though, I mean, it was sort of a jolt of energy when that happened.
Yeah, there was,
and how did that, impact things for
I
you
think
in terms of maybe gathering more volunteers, that sort of thing?
Enthusiasm definitely went up. And I think there was then the energy for something that came about, really wanting to see her win. That energy was definitely very apparent and stayed until the very end. We did see a lot more volunteers, a lot more people asking, what can we do? How can we help? And then engagement by new voters also was something that we saw.
Before we dig into the specific contests in Virginia that we're focusing on, I want to ask about turnout, and as we headed into this election year, I'm curious about what expectations you both had about turnout. I mean, as we found out, sadly, lowest since 2004. But going into this year, did you expect it? Did you hope to reach the levels that we'd had in 2020? Did you think you would fall short a little bit? Ken, let me start with you. I mean, what did you hope for on turnout?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, I think our goal was to increase the margins, and in a very flat sense, coming into this year, we were looking at increasing turnout. I think we were hoping for increased turnout, and we figured that running against a 4-year record, that was going to be helpful for us. One of the really interesting trends that we are particularly looking at right now is how we had this steady increase that we were expecting, that we were aiming for, that we were planning for. We made inroads in places we wanted to. We gained ground. I think so from our perspective, what we were looking at was a somewhat increase in turnout. Obviously, that didn't end up happening in the overall sense in the state. But I think in areas that we knew there was a larger potential Republican turnout by volume, we saw that. We saw that come to light. And I think it's really challenging to analyze before we have dug too deep into the numbers here. But to be honest, it looks like there was a larger Republican enthusiasm in areas where maybe in 2020 there was some enthusiasm, but not as much. And I think that's what we were shooting for.
Mm-hmm. Kéren, how about you?
Look, we always want more turnout. Democrats do well when there's more turnout. And so we were absolutely very focused on turnout. And we were actually looking at making sure, because the most previous statewide was 2021. So we weren't comparing to 20, but 2021. And wanting to turn out, particularly Democrats who did not turn out in 2021. So our focus was to make sure that we reach some of the sporadic Democrats and turn them out. And so we won Virginia, so I'm pleased. But I am waiting to see all the numbers just to see the breakdown. But turnout is definitely very important to us, and we definitely was very zeroed in on making sure we turned out not just our base, our regular, but also people who would definitely vote for us, but have not turned out but did not turn out in the previous year.
Let me follow up with this. I mean, the data shows us that Virginia Republicans are slowly but surely embracing early voting more than in the past. But, those graphics showed us a big drop-off for Democrats in early voting. They came back a little bit on Election Day. But how do you read that? Why did that happen?
In mail-in ballots specifically? Yeah.
And the overall early, yeah.
Yeah. I think, we started pushing early voting before it started because we wanted to get our folks ready to do the early voting. Where we are now is trying to determine those Democrats who want to early vote every election and those perhaps who don't. I think it's important that we meet people where they are. So we now have enough data that we're going to be able to see our regular early voters versus those that we can spend time and money on to get them to vote versus those who just want to vote on election day. And I do think the tactics are a little bit different. Once we're able to look at all the numbers, I think the drop off for Democrats was in mail-in ballots. But our early vote numbers were pretty consistent in most regions. There are definitely some regions, as I watch this in real time, that we want to figure out how do we get certain regions to match the early vote energy that we see in some of our other regions. Or if that's not the tendency of the electorate, making sure that we know what the tendency of the electorate is and then just reach people where they at and where they like to vote.
But you think 2024 is giving you data that's going to give you a clearer picture of what you need to do going forward?
Yes, absolutely. Yeah.
And Ken, you know, Republicans they're clearly encouraged by this shift of GOP voters to more early voting, and especially the shift to GOP candidates then in Northern Virginia in particular. I mean, what's your read on what happened there? Did more Republicans turn out? Did more independents go your way? Did more disaffected Democrats cast Republican ballots? I mean, why did we see this increase, you know, particularly in places like Northern Virginia? Yeah,
it's a great question, and obviously one we're always trying to figure out. My read on this is that, and it all comes back to this is a non-platitude, right? It comes back to listening to people. I think part of the problem is in years past, we have had an assumption that people are, you know, listening to the messages at all times, and people, you know, everyone is engaging at the same level that we are, you know. But we're in the business. We don't necessarily engage in political messaging the same way that the average voter does, or even a disaffected voter or a low turnout voter, someone who's not likely to show up. I think that part of the problem is, and part of the solution that we came to this year was actually listening to what folks were looking for who had so many other things going on in their lives, right? They are very busy. They have work, school, family, you know, people to take care of. It's hard to absorb all that different messaging, especially all the negative messaging. I think we cast one very positive pro-early vote message. And we said to folks, we know you're busy. We know it is tough on this Tuesday to make it out there for a lot of people. So here are all of your available options. I mean, you know, just at least on our side, we were sending out mail pieces, we were doing text messages, digital, and it was very simple messaging that said, you live in this county or city, your early vote hours are this, and here is your location, and hey, it's Friday before the election. You can still vote tomorrow if you think you might not be able to make it on Tuesday. I think it was a very simple, positive acknowledgement that people have very busy and challenging lives. And I honestly think that message resonated very well with Republicans who may have previously been less likely to vote early, but I also think a lot of independent voters who were possibly on the fence and who were getting messaging from both sides, I think they were absorbing that early vote messaging as well.
And Democrats still have a bit of an edge in early voting when you look at you know, in-person and mail, but you're happy with the progress you've seen with Republicans.
I mean, I think this was the year of steady progress for us. It's actually, and there's a very interesting VPAP graphic that we haven't seen up here yet, which we might see at some point, which showed early voting turnout by precinct. And percentages, and there were some particularly ex-urban precincts around Richmond. So you know, you're looking in kind of say Goochland, Outer Chesterfield, Powhatan, Hanover, those kind of areas where we had sky-high early voting turnout. And I think a lot of that can be lined up with commuter data. A lot of that can be lined up with you know, anybody who has to get in the car and travel very far, not necessarily for work, but for any reason. Being more enthused or at least encouraged at the prospect or feeling safe about the prospect of voting early.
And one of the things that, you know, we'll look at too is how many of our voters voted early who would have normally voted early versus how many new voters we brought in to, you know, to the party. And I think that's an important distinction too. Election day voters, did we just move election day voters to early vote? Or did we bring in either new voters in early vote or on election day. And parsing through that data will help us how we go further in encouraging people to really early vote.
Yeah, I mean, and right, strategically avoiding cannibalization of your election day totals is so key.
Yeah.
I think it's really tempting to go to your, to go to a local unit committee and say everybody should go vote early. And obviously we want folks to get out and go vote early, but if those folks are already planning on voting on election day, we can claim growth in early voting, but it's not actual growth until polls close on election day. So, and I think we kind of, on our side, we did this a little bit last year with Secure Your Vote Virginia. It was a pretty successful effort to get more Republicans voting early and absentee, but particularly early. And honestly, we continued the same messaging and trends this year. And I think that's a slow, steady growth.
Starting to break through.
Yeah.
And look, one thing to note, when we did the re-elect in 2018, there was no early vote. So as much as we think early vote has been the norm, it really isn't. So that's why the data and understanding the trends is really, this election is going to give us a little bit more information that we could use going forward, because it is still, essentially something that's still new to voters.
One thing on the one thing on the early and absentee totals is a big shift in reporting is that as of the last few years, now we can see absentee and early votes by precinct,
Right.
which is huge, especially when you're looking at a locality like Fairfax County. As it was over 252 precincts, or I'm not sure what the latest number is, but massive number of precincts in Fairfax County, and trying to extrapolate where early and absentee vote are coming from is tough. Now, this year and last year, we can actually see what areas are growing in early and absentee, which I think helps guide the message for the following year.
So aside from the winners, I think the other big headline that I want to dig into is what happened with more Republican voters in some of these key places like Northern Virginia and the erosion, the Democratic vote there. Ken, let me start with you. I mean, what happened? What do you read into that?
We had there's two sides of the coin, right? I mean, the first side is the percentage increase, which is partly due to, I think, depressed Democratic turnout in Fairfax and Loudoun, some in Prince William too, but also we significantly grew Republican vote share and votes by volume too in places like Loudoun. I think honestly there is a message for voters who are focused less on partisan politics, and I think this year, I mean, obviously it's very tough in any campaign to avoid partisan politics, but I think that we were talking a lot about semi-partisan or nonpartisan issues, and I think that these are two jurisdictions, the two biggest shifts we saw, that are a little more prone to things like inflation, changes in the economy. It's a high cost of living area. You have a lot of commuters. We have increasing amounts of traffic in Northern Virginia, as folks know, and I think that those are the kind of, when we're talking to voters about the inflation and crime and safety, I think that messaging sets in a little more in areas like Fairfax and Loudoun.
And Kéren,
I think what you're comparing, what year you're comparing to makes a difference. I think the most recent statewide election of 2021 wouldn't show an erosion in the suburbs because, for instance, Senator Kaine won Loudoun and won Chesterfield and won, so many of the suburban areas. So I think if there's a comparison to 2020, I do want to, be clear that 2020 was an outlier of a presidential election year, and that is important to note. So the most recent statewide election is 2021, and those are the comparisons that are probably more akin to what happened in 2024. And then the other thing that I would say, just look in statewide, particularly for the presidential race, 2008, 2012, 2016, the margin of win is very, very similar to the, probably 6% win at the end when all the votes are counted for Vice President Harris in Virginia. It's very, very similar to that trend. And that's why I think that 2020 was the outlier.
And we'll
race.
talk, in some of those congressional races, though, it tightened up a little bit. So that's,
exactly,
we'll talk about that. So, I mean, basically, you're not all that worried about what you saw?
I think
Democrats shouldn't be that worried?
I think Democrats, we know how to win and how to message. And I think one of the things that we were disciplined, particularly in the Senate race, and essentially because basically who Senator Tim Kaine is and his ability to campaign and the ground game in Virginia, it was almost as if he was atop of the ticket in Virginia, just carrying a lot of weight. And one thing that he was disciplined about was the messaging of the economy, making sure that Virginians know what Democrats have delivered for the economy, talking about make, grow, and build in Virginia. So I think that is a particular important piece to take away from this. The win in Virginia has to do with a very clear message of the economy in the Virginia as well. So I think continuing that trend, Democrats should make sure that we are communicating in every area of Virginia, particularly in the suburbs, of course, but in all parts of the Commonwealth, and communicating a message that voters feel that we can hear what they're going through in the time that they're going through it.
Yeah, go
I
ahead,
was just going to say, and Corinne, to your point, there was, I think, a clear difference between Senator Kaine's performance in Loudoun and Fairfax and Vice President Harris's performance in Loudoun and Fairfax. I mean, I think that the messaging, and interesting, right? Every side was messaging on the economy, and it seemed like there were a number of voters who trusted Senator Kaine's messaging on the economy and President Trump's messaging on the economy. I haven't seen the exact final numbers, but I'd imagine it's a little bit of a larger split than we've seen in recent years in Loudoun based on messaging.
Let's talk more about that Senate race. Congratulations to you for that. But Ken, let me start with you. Whenever I talk to Hung Kao, he always tied his campaign to Donald Trump. Reasoning that a Trump vote would be a Kao vote, and that no one would split their ticket. But he ended up with nearly 50,000 votes fewer than Donald Trump. I mean, was that a miscalculation to wage a campaign and tie it so closely to the top of the ticket like that, rather than, talking more about what he was going to do?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. And we did see this all over the country. I mean, I would talk specifically too about some congressional races here as well. I do think that there was a real unification of messaging. So it was a little bit more than just a Trump vote and a Kao vote. It was more, a Trump plan on the economy is a Kao plan on the economy, and so a little more in depth than that. I mean, look, to be honest, we had a very competitive Senate primary, which ended in late June, and a significant fundraising disadvantage against an incumbent senator running for his third term, who also so happened to be a governor who left office with a high approval rating. So, I think, yeah. So, I think Hung Kao is a great candidate. He spent a lot of time traveling the state, but the disadvantages when you're walking into a race like that, especially with such a competitive primary, you're essentially starting a general election on July 1 and against someone who has been running the general election for 8 years or so, 7 years. I do think that is, when you look at the 50,000 vote difference, I personally believe that a lot of that can be attributed to not necessarily solely fundraising differences, but fundraising and longevity of campaign challenges.
Yeah, I think, on our side, I think the senator was very focused on running a Virginia race. It really was about Virginia. He centralized Virginia. And I think that was key. That spoke to, Republicans, Democrats, independents. I think at the end of the day, realizing that Virginia is what is important to Virginians. And he spoke directly to that and made sure that everything we did was about the Virginia race and not nationalize the race in Virginia. And I think that helped. Obviously, I was actually counted up the number, but he did, 200 and I think 51 events. So needless to say, like, he just knows every corner of Virginia like the back of his hand.
I mean, you're kind of answering my next question, but he was the top vote getter in Virginia, as he was back in 2012, and again, exceeding the vice president's total, as the graphic showed, by 78,000 votes, and then doing significantly better than she in Southwest Virginia. I mean, you've started to answer that about how he tailored his campaign, but did you expect those results, and why do you think he got those results?
So again, I think being so zeroed in on Virginia and Virginians and going everywhere and talking to everyone. One of the great attributes of the senator is that you might disagree with him, but you like that he came to talk to you. He's not afraid to answer tough questions, and we took a lot of tough questions in Virginia, and there, started off the campaign with some discontent in Gaza and in Israel. So it's not as if Virginians didn't give him tough questions. They did. I think the idea and the result of him always going everywhere, not shying away from the difficult issues, the difficult policy topics. And I think that worked to our benefit. And the other thing that I would say, particularly because you mentioned Southwest Virginia, it is really important, and it's something that I say to any Virginian running for statewide office as a Democrat. Just because Southwest Virginia may not be an area that Democrats win yet, we're still working on it, but it doesn't mean that you don't show up. And I think showing up is very, very important to people, and it matters to people. And we have definitely made it a point to be in every part, including in Southwest Virginia, as consistently as we are in Northern Virginia or Hampton Roads.
Let's dig into some of the congressional races. Now, the ones that were competitive anyway, as we said earlier, Republicans held their seat, Democrats held the two open seats that they had held previously. But let's look at the second first. So in 2008, that district flipped from Republican to Democrat. Since then, it's flipped 3 times. Congresswoman Kiggins, as we mentioned, she defeated the incumbent in 2022 by 3 points. She won by 4 points this time over challenger Missy Cotter Smazel. Redistricting has helped to make that a safer seat for Republicans. Ken, how competitive is this seat anymore, do you think?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, it is a seat, particularly due to the heavy military presence, that does experience a bit more turnover than some other congressional seats. I think it is within 3 to 4 points is still always very competitive. I think the question is, as long as Congresswoman Kiggins is there, it's going to be a less competitive seat because she is such a powerhouse in the district. And speaking of presence and traveling around, I know she's been from every corner, Accomack to Tangier, down to Virginia Beach, over to Suffolk. One of the very interesting things about participating in the campaign with the Congresswoman is anywhere you go, she's been there, she's been out and about in the community, and she, I think she also has an office that has excellent constituent services. So they are very focused on helping Virginians. Mathematically, the seat is going to remain competitive, and it is absolutely not something we are going to be sleeping on anytime soon. But I do think that Congresswoman Kiggins' win, 4-point win, was both significant and going to indicates a good trend going forward.
Yeah, was that increase in just a slight increase in the margin of victory there? Is that indicative just of the fact that she was the incumbent there, or does it give you any pause?
Yeah, no, I think being the incumbent there definitely absolutely helps. And I think, my advice to, the next Democratic challenger, one thing about the region is to know that they're ticket splitters, and that's something that's been very consistent. That's the second, even before redistricting, it was consistent in ticket splitting. So adjusting your tactics is important, knowing that going in. But I do agree. I think it's going to remain competitive. Again, as Democrats, we're not ceding any ground. If I say that, look, I want to one day win Southwest Virginia, it's because we're not ceding any ground. We're going to remain, we're going to keep going after voters and hope to win, and that's not going to change in the second for sure.
One of the really interesting things about the second is the high concentration of localities that have local races and constitutional races in the even years. So all of the cities, like Virginia Beach had some very competitive elections this year. a lot of times many of our counties will see elections in the off year, in the odd years. So I think that there's an interesting dynamic, particularly as we talk about ticket splitters, to think about how many local races there are on the ballot, which are much or significantly less partisan and driven by stop signs and paving roads and city services than they are by national politics. So, and I think one of the things that Congresswoman Keegan's did, to echo your point about Senator Kaine, is keep it very focused on the 2nd District. It's something the voters are hearing, the messages about local politics, about what's going on in their area, and I think that was definitely an ingredient for success.
Let's look at the 7th. That was the most competitive of the 3. In spite of an enormous fundraising advantage, Eugene Vindman just narrowly won that seat over Derek Anderson. Ken, let me start with you. How hopeful had Republicans been that they might flip this seat, and do you think money was the big difference maker there?
Yeah, I mean, we were very hopeful, I'll say. Yeah. I think it was an incredibly competitive seat, one of the top competitive seats in the nation if you look at the distribution of the points distribution. I mean, what was the final total? It was over 14 million that Congressman-elect Vindman raised, I think. That's got to be significant in terms of the number of messages you can deliver to each voter, the number of people you can employ to be on the ground in every corner of the district. And frankly, the number of times you can speak to people who may be either disaffected or not necessarily willing to turn out. The other side of it is, I think, one of the big aspects or the big benefits of such a well-funded campaign as Congressman-elect Vindman had is the ability to get to potential ticket splitters. I think that in these competitive races, money can be significantly impactful with ticket splitters because you are delivering a completely different message than what they may have mentally committed to already at the top of the ticket. So I think that money definitely played a huge advantage, not so much generically, but specifically in the way the Congressman-elect ran his campaign.
Yeah, I mean, it's tough because I live in Northern Virginia, so I got all the ads.
Yeah.
And boy.
Thank goodness those are behind you.
It is, the onslaught, and we're getting all of Maryland's ads too, and Maryland had a competitive race. So I worried that though there's a money advantage, at the end of the day, what are your voters really listening to? Because I came up through campaigns in the field, I am a big proponent of field organization, and I think that seat was won because of a very solid field organization that we really, in a coordinated plan, that we work together as Democrats to collectively come together, and that seat was one that benefited from that coordination.
And so benefited really from the Spanberger operation previously to a great degree?
No, just the Kaine, Harris, Vindman coordinating, pulling together our resources for field. So the door knocking was really a joint. It was the pieces were joint pieces. So I think there was a big benefit in a coordinated plan of attack on the ground in that district in particular.
Let's turn to the 10th now too. So Democrats have won that seat 4 straight cycles now. Redistricting has only made it a little bit more blue than it was before. But that's another place where we see the margin of victory declining. Jennifer Wexton won her 3rd term in the 10th by 6 points. Suhasini Subramaniam won by about 4 points. And this, again, is that district where we saw a shift to the Republican candidate. We've talked about it a little bit more, but why isn't it a sign that Democratic support is waning a bit?
I mean, you have to consider so many factors. And one, Jennifer Wexton is loved in this district. I mean, just absolutely loved. To the point, Senator Kaine has strong constituent services. Jennifer Wexton have very strong constituent services. So incumbents, and to your point about Congresswoman Keegan's, in incumbents who have strong relationship and strong constituent services, I think that plays into the factor. Keep in mind, both in the 10th and the 7th, these are 2 new people that are being introduced to the electorate. And I think just naturally there are, is this person going to serve me as well? Should I make a change? What is going on? So that's why the communication is important. That's why the ground game is important, because you are introducing in a time frame where there's a lot of messages coming to the electorate. You're trying to introduce a new person, and that is an important factor that you can't discount when thinking about it. So for me, my advice to Democrats as we go forward, those who've won their seat, to just continue that conversation and establish a relationship with your electorate in making sure that what they're experiencing from you as they get to know you is a positive one, because then we'll benefit from being an incumbent the next time around. I think that's really important. So I would factor in that, two in the 10th, introducing 2 new people is not an easy feat.
Ken, Republicans kind of had their hopes up a little bit about that seat, but I mean, what's it going to take there to reclaim that? And do you see any encouraging signs in what happened?
Yeah, I think we see several encouraging signs. I mean, usually we're comparing apples and oranges, right? 2022 was a year that was a little bit better for Republicans, but Congresswoman Wexton was an incumbent. We had a very competitive primary, albeit a party-run process, so we were able to do it about a month earlier. Yeah. But still, we had a competitive primary, and then we hit the ground running against an incumbent. I think one of the interesting things about this is, we had 2 competitive primaries with 2 new candidates. Both of whom, the congressman-elect has held office in the district before, but he was a sitting senator. Right. But I mean, I think we had 2 competitive primaries and then 2 general elections. So if you look at where we were in a little bit better year for Republicans in 2022, we had a decent year in 2022, and then Congresswoman Wexton winning re-election by 6 points. Now we've narrowed the gap to 4 points in an open year. I think it's going to be about slow and steady winning the race. I think we can continue to pick up ground, and that is what the trend shows.
Getting my 5-minute warning right now, so I'm going to zip ahead to some other questions. So I want to look ahead to 2025 because I know that's a natural thing to do here. Virginia Republicans clearly had a better night in 2024 than they had in 2020, but we all know Virginia Republicans. Virginia Republicans. Well, national, but Virginia Republicans felt good about some of the things they saw, and certainly better than 20. Anyway, but aside from 2013, we all know the history. Virginia has elected a governor from the party not in the White House. So, what could be different this year that would give you confidence that Republicans could reverse that trend in 2025?
Yeah, I mean, I'm not a big fan of looking at overarching trends without digging into the why, right? So I think that the why in 2021 was pretty easy. There were a lot of issues that folks were very concerned about that they didn't feel were being addressed. I think education was top among them, right? So that was a reversal because voters looked at Governor Youngkin and his messaging on education, the issue at the top of their mind, and that was their one of the big motivating factors. I think that this year, more than any, what we have done is really refine our ability to talk to those voters who are a little more disengaged, a little more disaffected, or frankly even busier, and they don't have time to watch the 40 commercials that come on in between segments. And so I think that what we're looking at in 2025 is, can we continue our trend of reaching those disaffected voters? If we can do that, I think we're going to see a similar situation to 2013. If we can't do that, then the overarching trend will be challenging to overcome.
Corinne, your prediction, and I'm a little interested in what you'll have to say about, what we see play out in Washington is obviously going to have an impact on Virginia as it did before.
First, let me just say for Virginia Democrats, I mean, we did win Virginia, and that's really important. So we are coming in with a very strong win in a that was a very difficult national cycle for Democrats. So I want to make sure that as we go into 2025, we are going with our head held high.
I was just comparing Republicans 2020. Okay.
So that's important. And look, I think I always come back to this. I think Democrats in Virginia, we know how to communicate, and we should just do that. And we should do that with the precision that we know how. We really have. This is now the 5th time we have put. We won the presidency in Virginia. Statewide elections. So we know how to win, and we know, and the reason we know how to win is because we do know how to communicate and we know how to turn out our votes. And we should just keep doing that. Do what we know how to do and focus on Virginia, and I think we'll be good to go.
One audience question, 30 seconds each on this one, if we can. The person asked, the polls were wrong in 2016, wrong again this year. How can we ever trust polls again?
Well, look, it depends on what polls you're reading. The one thing you have to remember is that there are a lot of polls come out. Anytime a poll comes out, the first thing you need to do is see who they're asking and what questions are they asking. It's not that top number. You got to look into the details. Those details are really important because I would say in Virginia, the polls that we were looking at were actually right on point.
Yeah, I mean, I'll echo that. It's crosstabs, right? Looking at the specific data. The worst thing you can look at is the average of all polls. That is the worst thing we can look at, but yeah.
Well, I have more questions that I had to leave behind, unfortunately, but we have to take a brief break and bring our next panel up here. Thanks so much to Virginia Republican Party Executive Director Ken Nunnenkamp and to you, Kéren Charles Dongo, Senator Kaine's campaign manager. Thanks so much for being with us. Really insightful, really interesting. We appreciate it.
Thank you.
And stay with us. We'll be right back.
Yeah.
This brewery didn't exist 2 years ago. But Athletic Brewing started working with Walmart. I needed to brew a lot more non-alcoholic beer.
And hire a lot more people, 200 more people. Walmart is helping create 750,000 US jobs, like these.
At companies like ours.
In places like this.
Tastes great and creates US jobs.
I'll drink to that. Cheers. Nailed it.
In the Navy, I train recruits. At Walmart, I recruit veterans. So many veterans have built their careers here.
Served in the Army for 11 years. I was promoted 4 times. Been with Walmart 9 years. I've been promoted 5 times.
I started as an hourly associate, and now I run the store.
430,000 veterans hired in the last decade. That's more than serving in the U.S. Navy today.
There's no better place for veterans to work.
In these divided times, people are less willing to trust what they read, particularly when it comes to politics. In Virginia, there's a fiercely nonpartisan group that takes a different approach. The Virginia Public Access Project, known as VPAP, is a nonprofit that organizes verifiable facts so you can see for yourself and reach your own conclusions. Our premise is simple, that an informed electorate is key to a vibrant democracy. We don't lobby or take positions on the issues. We are committed to accuracy. Our mission is to elevate public understanding by presenting factual information in ways that are easily understood and free of partisan bias. Our services are free and available to anyone. We are funded by our users who come from across the political spectrum. See for yourself at vpap.org, where you'll find information about Virginia politics that's designed to inform, not inflame. VPAP's work is made possible by donors like you. Thank you.
Mrs. Luria.
Really?
Welcome back, everyone. I am joined now by our distinguished political analysts. We'll be discussing the results and what they mean for Virginia heading into the gubernatorial race in 2025. I'm pleased to welcome Dr. Bob Holsworth. He's the founding director of the Center for Public Policy and the L. Douglas Wilder School of Government and Public Affairs at Virginia Commonwealth University. And Dr. Mark Rozell, he is the dean of the Schar School of Policy and Government here at George Mason University. Welcome to both of you. Thanks a lot for being here. After hearing that first panel, I'm sure you're eager to dive right in on some of those topics. Let's start with this. So Donald Trump has been on the ballot in Virginia 3 times now, losing by 5 points in 2016 to Hillary Clinton, 10 points to Joe Biden in 2010, 5 points again to Kamala Harris in 2024. You know, the obvious message hit you over the head might be that Virginia voters just don't like Donald Trump very much. But as you compare and contrast those election years, what do you see? Either one of you jump in.
You go first, Mark.
Importantly, Trump decreased his margin of loss in Virginia this time, which was meaningful. Harris won by about the same percentage as Hillary Clinton did in Virginia in 2016, and of course Joe Biden won by double digits in 2020. But I think one of the key findings in this election cycle was the somewhat decreased turnout in Northern Virginia, which was supposed to go strong for Harris, and the significantly declining margins for her in this region of the state compared to what Joe Biden received. So I can't remember all the numbers off the top of my head, so I just wrote some things down here. Fairfax County, 35% up for Harris this year, 43 for Biden, 8 percentage points difference towards the political right. Loudoun was a 9 percentage points difference toward Trump. Prince William, 9 percentage points. Manassas City, 10 percentage points. Even Arlington, 5 percentage points. And Harris did only better in Albemarle County by a tiny bit, and Chesterfield by 2 percentage points, which is really interesting. So in Northern Virginia, there was a turn to the right, and also a somewhat depressed turnout where the Democrats are really counting on a strong turnout in voter-rich Northern Virginia, which has been the bulwark of Democratic Party statewide elections in the modern era. So I think the Democrats have a lot of soul searching to do about why things turned out the way that they did in Northern Virginia in particular.
Bob, you heard, Kéren saying, though, that she really looks back and compares it to 2021. I mean, how do you see it?
Well, there are two options to how to look at this.
Yeah.
So one is Kéren looks at it in the most positive way for the Democrats. And largely what you say is that there was a V. 2016, it was 5 points. 2020, it was 10. The V went, the sort of a reverse V.
Yeah.
Then it went back to 5. So no problem. We have that cushion in Virginia. The challenge, of course, is that you look at the Youngkin election and you say, well, that cushion disappeared very quickly in 2021. And here now you see this sort of fairly significant right shift everywhere, but a higher right shift in Northern Virginia, the most populous part of the state, and where Democrats have done very well. So on one hand, you can just say we still won, we won by 5 points, things are good. I tend to be a little more skeptical of that. I think there's something that's happening in Northern Virginia. It happened in these congressional races as well. Vindman by no means came near as close to, had a margin that was nowhere near what Abigail Spanberger's margin was. This 10th district that no one thought was going to be very competitive at all of a sudden became quite competitive. And I think if I'm the Democrats right now, I'd want to take another look rather than be a little complacent and just say, heck, we just went back to normal here, we regressed to the mean. I think something might be happening that is more troublesome for them.
We'll talk more about the whys of that in just a minute. How much, though, does 2024 solidify the impression that Virginia is really more of a blue state than a purple state when it comes to presidential election years?
Well, you can't deny 5 consecutive elections, right? That the Democrats have won. So I think this election cycle really proved that Virginia is not the path to the presidency for Republicans. So yes, Harris won the state by a comfortable margin, over 5%. But that, again, was a decrease in margin over where it was in 2020. Look, when we did the Washington Post Schar School poll the week before the election, we had it at 6 points, so some polls are good, right? But I took that as a warning sign because that's exactly where we had Hillary Clinton the week before the election in 2016. And the margin we had for Joe Biden, we hit it on the head all 3 times. In 2020, the week before the election, was 10 percentage points. So just seeing that significant decline here suggested to me that there was something going on more broadly that would be reflected in other parts of the country, and that's certainly what happened. By the way, just one really interesting statistic. Donald Trump did better in this election cycle than he did in 2020 in 124 out of 133 localities in Virginia.
That's pretty striking.
That's a really striking statistic.
To that issue, though, Virginia's a blue state in the presidential years.
I think it's probably a second-tier state. I can imagine a situation there where it's not. If you look right now, Donald Trump's been on the ticket 3 times in a row for the Republicans, and even though he did better in Northern Virginia, his message has been so terrible for Northern Virginia. In 2016 and 2020, he was somebody who's going to drain the swamp, i.e. Northern Virginia. And in 2024, he says he's going to relocate a good portion of the federal workforce to other states, which is, again, a direct assault on Northern Virginia. So a different kind of Republican candidate might be better, but it's still, when you're going to look at the battleground states, Virginia is not going to be at the moment a first-tier state again for a
And
while.
that was the huge surprise, right? That his message sounded so much more threatening to the regional economy here in Northern Virginia. You know, people still say it's a company town. It's not quite the company town that it used to be, right? It's a very vibrant economy in many sectors, but nonetheless, going after federal agencies and departments and suggesting that some have to be moved out, and Elon Musk is talking about cutting the federal workforce by 75%. Well, wow, there was supposed to be a big upsurge in voting in Northern Virginia to protect the region, its regional economy and government workers. Well, what happened there?
And I was surprised that more of the Northern Virginia candidates weren't talking about that. I mean, it was not, you know,
That's right.
the Democratic candidates, you know, were talking about abortion rights and the economy, but you didn't hear that mentioned as much. It was down the list a little bit. I was surprised by that. Before we talk about some of these shifts that you're talking about to, you know, to Republican candidates, I do want to get your thoughts though about turnout and why it declined so much overall. What do you both think about that?
Well, I think there are two reasons for the turnout decline as far as I could tell. First, we're not a battleground state. That we had been a battleground state for many years, or presumed that we could have been a battleground state. I think it was a foregone conclusion that we weren't a battleground state. If you saw the ad visual that was put up, those ads weren't intended for Virginia. They were in the Tidewater market intended for Eastern North Carolina. They weren't necessarily intended for Virginia. So by and large, the national election didn't occur here for the most part, and no one ever thought the Senate race was going to be very competitive as well. So you had that one point. Secondly, I do think that you have a messaging issue with people who are episodic and intermittent voters who are turning off from the political system. And I was just talking to Mark earlier, where I probably disagree a little bit with Kéren said about how great a messenger the Democrats are, largely because it's becoming more and more difficult to say, how do you message with people not reading newspapers, you know, probably turning off a lot of the television, and we have all of these new places where people are going. And I just mentioned that I talked to a government club of high school students yesterday, and at the end I just asked them, how many of you read a newspaper every day? 0 out of 60. How many of you watch cable news? Maybe 3. How many of you know Joe Rogan? 30 to 40. So what you find is that there's just a wholly different messaging environment right now, and given the fact that we weren't a battleground state, and the fact that there are just so many people turned off from politics, I think that's having an impact.
Mark?
Yeah, well, there's a lack of enthusiasm, not a lack, but a decrease in enthusiasm among the Democratic base, without a doubt. Some of that may have been messaging. I thought it was a mistake to be talking late in the campaign about Liz Cheney and traditional Republicans who are supporting the Democratic ticket. I don't think the Cheneys are terribly popular with the Democratic Party voting base. And of course, discontent over the state of the economy, the perceived state of the economy, certainly had an impact. And then the party pushed very hard on the issue of abortion, which the numbers looked very good in the public opinion polls, that the voters were very much on the side of Harris on that issue overall, but it turned out being pretty low on the list of priorities of major issues that drove voting behavior in this election cycle compared to where the Democrats thought the numbers should be. And it was a hugely disappointing outcome for the Democratic campaign in Virginia with young voters that went for Harris but again, by a significantly lower percentage than had supported Biden, and women voters as well.
So you started talking about it, but the most profound result was that shift where, you know, Republicans getting better margins in places where we don't expect them to. And especially striking, I think, in the 10th Congressional District where, you know, Mike Clancy ran almost even with Suhassi Ramanyam in both Fairfax and Prince William counties. Loudoun's obviously the big piece of that district, but you know, as I mentioned, in the 7th and the 10th, the winners this time ran behind or won by smaller margins. So Bob, what do you attribute that erosion to? I mean, why weren't Democrats? there, and why were Republicans turning out in Northern Virginia?
Yeah, I would re-emphasize that it's Northern Virginia, that the right shift in Hampton Roads and RVA in the Richmond area was nowhere near what it was in Northern Virginia. So we had this sense of a maybe declining Democratic enthusiasm. Maybe, again, some people are, just thought that this election was a foregone conclusion on that front. But beyond that, I think Northern Virginia is a very expensive place to live. I think some of those issues about rent and energy and groceries probably have a real impact on working class people in Northern Virginia. It just seems to me that given the expense of living here and given the fact that that was part of the national outlook and sort of the national ethos during this election, and it impacted here. And that's why I'm not so sure that the Democrats can just say, well, we won by 5 points statewide and everything's hunky-dory. I'm not sure it is. In addition, I think that the Democratic base has absolutely collapsed in rural Virginia. And while Kaine may have run a little better than Harris, I don't expect the Democrats to do very well in a gubernatorial election there as well. So I think they have to really be careful about this.
We know nationally that GOP numbers were bumped up by Hispanic and Asian voters. How much are you seeing that replicated in Northern Virginia in particular?
Well, we saw that pretty big. So look at where Trump bettered his performance in 2024 as opposed to 2020. We're talking a lot about Northern Virginia. These are some of the most ethnically, racially diverse regions of the entire state. Loudoun County, about 26% of the people living there are foreign-born, and 43% have at least one foreign-born parent. And there's a lot of data showing that Trump, both nationally and in Virginia, significantly increased the showing for a Republican presidential candidate among minority voters who typically had been voting heavily Democrat in the past. So the shift among Latinos has been talked about the most, but also counties such as Loudoun, again, with a very heavy East and South Asian populations. Asian Americans shifted by a significant percentage to the right, and so that the Democratic margin had decreased significantly in this election cycle. So I think perhaps immigrant populations, diverse populations who abandoned their normally very heavily Democratic Party leanings in voting had a lot to do with that.
So, Bob, is it sustainable, though, for Republicans? I mean, or...
Well, it is sustainable in some ways. I mean, the challenge for Republicans in Virginia and in Northern Virginia right now is really the Trump administration. That, by and large, if the Trump administration sort of goes and furthers the policies that it said it was going to implement, that could be a challenge. Because you're going to wind up, if you wind up with part of the economic base leaving because of relocations, my sense is that deportation issues could become very prominent in the next 6 months in Virginia, and in particular, Northern Virginia may be a place where it is, and one doesn't know how there's going to be a reaction to that. And in the past, after Trump won in 2016, that ushered in sort of the best time for the Democrats in Virginia in a generation. Ralph Northam won by almost double digits. The Democrats took control of both houses of the state legislature. So the open question here is, will a Trump administration build upon the gains that the Republicans have made in Northern Virginia, or will we find something very similar to 2016, where the Republicans were all of a sudden found that every Republican at every level of government down to the school board was running with Donald Trump.
Right.
And we saw that briefly broken by Glenn Youngkin's victory. But Mark, what's the likelihood that's going to happen again? Is history going to repeat itself and favor Democrats?
Right. So for the past half century, with one exception, 2013, McAuliffe's election, the party that is in the White House the next year lost the governor's race in Virginia. Now, that doesn't necessarily predict the future, but I think Donald Trump may be a special case. So trying to think about what are some of the silver linings for Democrats here in this election, which I don't think many people are talking about, and I certainly had to write those down because it wasn't easy to think about that. But first, what happened after 2016, right? The GOP lost every statewide race in Virginia during Trump's term in office. They lost both houses of the General Assembly, and they did not have a majority of the delegation to the House of Representatives. So the party got shellacked in Virginia during the 4 years that Trump was in office. So I think there's something there for Democrats to hold on to that, look, if it's going to be Matt Gaetz as Attorney General and Tulsi Gabbard in charge of, the nation's secrets and, some of the other appointments that are very controversial, and if Trump is going to make good on some of the promises that he has made about moving federal agencies out of the Washington region and gutting some of the federal workforce, let's see if Northern Virginia feels the same way in the next 4 years. As happened in this election cycle where Democrats were just befuddled that they didn't get the strong turnout that they were expecting. And, they were expecting with all these threats on the horizon that there would be a supercharged turnout for Harris. And that just didn't happen. So, but I would also point out that some of the issues that drove this election cycle are not what I would call permanent issues, right? They were, I think, important to the context of this election cycle. But they're not necessarily the issues we'll be talking about 4 years from now, hyperinflation. The Republicans now own everything, right? So, there was a bit of an anti-incumbency mood in the election this year. You have an incumbent president with under 40% approval ratings. That's not going to be there against the Democrats. So I think there's a lot of things that could be in play over the next 4 years that in Virginia in particular could play to the party's advantage.
Speaking of administration appointments, last week Governor Glenn Youngkin told a reporter at one of our sister stations at WWBT that he's not interested in a position in the Trump administration. He said he'd consulted with the president-elect and that Mr. Trump was, quote, very supportive of me finishing the job I've committed to. So what's your guess about Governor Youngkin's future plans?
Well, I think he wants to run for president, basically. So, joining the Trump administration is a double-edged sword. There's very few people who have joined who have come out, much better on the other end. And then secondly, Donald Trump is not necessarily the type of person who likes to highlight the accomplishments of his subordinates on that front. So I think that's a smart move. I think he's going to get a lot of pressure from Republicans in Washington to run against Mark Warner in 2026 because they want to flip that seat. But on the other hand, that's kind of a risk. A Hillary Clinton or a Barack Obama could run for a Senate seat in New York and Illinois because they know they're going to win. Glenn Youngkin could lose that race. That's a very competitive race there, and that would jettison his presidential chances. So my guess is that what he does is that find some way of forming a group, forming an alliance, joining a think tank that enables him to be a player in Republican politics and build the kind of base and national visibility that he doesn't have now that would enable him to have a message for 2028. And my guess is that it'll be something around education and the Parents Matter message that he's been putting forward.
What's your guess about what he has in mind now and what that signals, the fact that he says he's staying put?
Governor Youngkin? Yeah. Well, I think Bob got it exactly right. It's too risky to run for the U.S. Senate. Mark Warner is very popular unless he were to step down and it becomes an open seat, which I don't think will happen. So, hey, he can keep going on Fox News. He can start a podcast. He can try to keep himself visible before the public. There are so many venues by which somebody can keep very visible publicly, and he's been very good about going on the cable news programs where he can amplify his national presence and his message on issues such as education, where he's certainly made a name for himself. So I don't think he has to have an appointment or an elective office in order to have a public profile necessarily. So I wouldn't write him off. And he clearly does have national political aspirations. And hey, a lot of people thought he was going to jump in this time around. And obviously he made the right choice not to do that. It wasn't the right time.
During this election year, though, we saw a dramatic shift in his relationship with Donald Trump, from going to a point where he was keeping him at arm's length to, fully embracing Donald Trump now. So looking ahead, benefits and risks, you were talking about the double-edged sword, because, if we see the Trump administration start to carry out some of these policies, it could really hit hard in Northern Virginia with moving out federal workers, with mass deportation. I mean, isn't there kind of a potentially fraught time ahead for the governor?
Yeah, it's very interesting to see what would happen there. So on one hand, he's basically saying, I'm not sure that relocation will really occur with federal workers, can't occur very quickly anyway, going to have new places, won't be the worst thing in the world. In many ways, he might be asked to help support the deportation efforts, that he is not going to take the position of Trump-proofing a state like Gavin Newsom has. I think he'll take an alternative position, largely thinking that that's pretty popular right now. And it is, at least in theory. We'll have to see how popular it remains when we see the execution of the deportation effort. And maybe it remains popular, but maybe it doesn't. But that's going to be out there for him as well. And my other guess is that I think you're going to see him spend a lot of time addressing the issue that we saw in all of these Republican ads, if you were watching football games this year, which is the transgender issue. That he has put these model policies in front of school boards. Most of them are adopting them. If they don't, he's threatening to take them to court, such as Fairfax County and the city of Richmond. So I think we might see him try to become even more visible on that issue over the next 12 months.
Yeah, just one thing quickly, too. He has to be careful about putting his political capital on the line in supporting Republican candidates in the next Trump era in elections in Virginia, both for the General Assembly and also for the House of Representatives. He had a record of trying to transfer his popularity, his public support, his fundraising and the like to help candidates throughout the Commonwealth, and things did not go his way particularly, and he lost maybe a little bit of luster, but I don't think too much. I mean, a lot of analysts said that was a bad look for him, but latest public opinion polls we did, he's still pretty popular in Virginia right now, so maybe he'll try some of the same. I don't know.
Yeah, but that's one of the interesting challenges he has. He has a lot of personal popularity. You look at his polling, it's pretty good. I mean, very good, actually. At the same time, he's had some trouble transferring that popularity to other Republican candidates in Virginia. So it will be interesting to see what position and posture he takes coming into this gubernatorial race in 2025. How much is he out there supporting and endorsing and working and raising money for Republican candidates for governor?
Let's take a look at that potential governor's race. I mean, right now, as it stands, we've got Democratic Congresswoman Abigail Spanberger versus Republican Lieutenant Governor Winsome Sears. I mean, we don't know if that's going to be the matchup or not. We're waiting to see. But how do these election results that we just saw in Virginia inform what the nominees are going to want to do as far as issues, as far as strategy?
Wow. So if you take the message from this campaign that on the social and cultural issues, the Democrats lost significant support among some voting groups that they should clearly have done much better with, I would expect Abigail Spanberger, really to do what she did in her campaigns in the 7th District, which is to run as a more centrist type Democrat. Remember, she was someone who was openly against Nancy Pelosi, continuing as the Speaker of the House. She angered some of the progressive wing of the Democratic Party, but she was running in a district that's considered kind of a flip district in the 7th, and also talked a lot about her national security credentials and the like. So I think this puts her in a solid position to be seen as somebody who's more toward the critical middle of the electorate, and that's certainly been her calling card to this point as a Democratic candidate in a swing district.
Yeah, it'll be interesting to me to see what particular issues she decides to focus on and run on. Certainly she'll be talking about reproductive rights. The Democrats are also going to have a constitutional amendment for the restoration of voting rights for people who have served their time. But at the same time, just running to the middle may not simply be enough in some fashion. She's going to have to thread a needle on some other issues that are going to come up. Certainly, Winsome Sears or whoever the Republican candidate is going to be talking about transgender issues in education, Parents Matter issues there. But they're also going to be talking about right to work, where the Democrats are going to find that the unions that have supported Democrats are going to be less likely this time to be very willing to say, okay, you can just thread the needle here. Yeah. They want to find a Democrat who's really going to be more aggressive. Unions are more popular today. Unions are extraordinarily supportive of Democrats. They put a lot of work in on their behalf. And from what I'm hearing from Democrats further down the ticket, the unions want to know what their position is right now. So that could become a dividing line there. At the same time, very strong candidate. She's sitting here raising money. In both of her elections, she really mobilizes supporters. The volunteers who come and work for her are amazing. I remember her first campaign when she ran against Dave Bratt in the Richmond area, and Bratt started complaining about all the women who were in his grill on that front. But that was an example of how many just people she just mobilized to come and, and go to his town halls. It was just extraordinary. So she's a real strong candidate, and at the same time, we have to see whether Winsome Sears is the only candidate on the Republican side or whether somebody else gets in this race, or are they in some ways frightened a little bit about what a Donald Trump presidency might mean for a GOP candidate next year.
Yeah. And it's potentially a history-making campaign, right? I mean, we're talking about the first woman governor of Virginia. The Democrats like to talk about supporting diverse populations. The Republicans have put it up in a three-candidate ticket the last time around in 2021 and produced the most diverse statewide slate ever in Virginia. So, yeah.
Can't wait to cover it.
Yes.
I'm wondering too, if there are some really immediate lessons in these national exit polls for Democratic leaders in the General Assembly as they consider how far left to take their agenda. I mean, we look at things like cannabis measures on the ballot across this country. Only one of the 5 succeeded. And you've mentioned transgender rights and transgender policy. I mean, that drove a lot of Republican voters to make the decision they did. So what's your expectation about whether or not Virginia Democrats in the General Assembly might pull back? We certainly saw them moving right ahead today to get legislation started on a constitutional amendment for abortion rights, restoration of felon rights, and marriage equality. But
well, there are some issues, I think, where the Democrats move a little bit to the left and are popular. I think the abortion issue, the restoration of rights, issues about minimum wage, all of those tend to be very, very popular with the general public. So I don't expect the Democrats to go backwards on that. At the same time, I also expect that they're not going to go along with whatever tax cuts that Governor Youngkin proposes on a permanent basis in this session. The Democrats are not going to wind up reducing the corporate income tax, and they're not going to reduce the individual income tax unless there's some kind of progressive change to it, which I think the governor is unlikely to propose. So if they're going to get a tax cut this year, I think you're going to wind up once again with some kind of rebate that could go to everybody, and that's on a one-time basis rather than a permanent basis. At the same time, other issues that I think are important that neither party quite knows how to handle right now are like housing. How do you build more homes? The governor has said he would like to find a way to reduce the regulations and zoning restrictions that you have in localities that puts them in some ways at odds with some of the local government organizations. But that's a big issue about how in the world do you keep more housing that might ultimately reduce rents and make it more available for first-time home buyers. Those are big issues that I'm not sure anybody has fully addressed yet.
do you think there'll be any retreat? Again, just based on what, for the Virginia Democrats in their agenda.
Well, I don't see how the Democrats can come away from this election cycle and not recalibrate their message on a number of issues. Yes, they won in Virginia by several percentage points, 5 to 6%, but a much lower margin than they had in 2020. And again, the lower turnouts where they needed bigger turnouts to drive up their numbers that they typically would expect in a statewide election, suggests that some of the message just wasn't getting through as they expected it to. So particularly on some of the social cultural issues where I think the Democrats had expected to drive up significantly the percentages of turnout among their core voters, they might have to reconsider. But also I want to point out, reaching out to young voters. Harris did significantly less well among those under 30 years of age than Joe Biden had. And remember all the talk about Joe Biden being too old and not being able to appeal to young voters, and Democrats nominate someone who's 2 decades younger, and they say, look at that, the Republicans got the old guy now, ha-ha. And yet the margins decreased substantially among young voters. So something's happening there. The party has to think very seriously about what happened, why, and how to get those voters back that they had by much more comfortable margins the last time.
Part of this issue is to think about whether the Youngkin election in 2021 was a one-off or whether it really was an indicator of where Virginia kind of is as a competitive state in statewide elections in non-presidential years. So there's some sense that, well, with COVID, you had 18 months of remote learning, you had parents in a foul mood throughout the state, and that was kind of a one-off. But maybe it isn't. And maybe some of these issues that are perplexing the Democrats right now, turnout among young voters is going to be very difficult to drive that in an off-year election there. And also, you have the turnout in some of the core cities, where in the Richmond area, for example, the Democrats didn't lose much in Henrico. They actually gained in Chesterfield, but they lost in the city of Richmond. They lost the margin. They won by 80%. They still had 85%, but the turnout was down. The margin was down somewhat. Spanberger has never had to run in an election where was really dependent on turning out minority voters there. That's really important in a gubernatorial race. So there are things that I think they can handle, but I'm just unsure if I would say that they absolutely know how to message, because I'm not sure they know how to message effectively as they had once had to some of their core constituencies.
The rise of rural Virginia, right? 2021 and this election cycle, the turnouts in 2021 in the rural areas of the state for Youngkin were just phenomenal. So Terry McAuliffe likes to say that if you had handed him the absolute number of votes that he actually did get on election day before the 2021 election, he would have thought it's over. He would have won by landslide, right? And then you had some localities with upwards of 80% turnout in this election cycle, which is just absolutely stunning. So something's happening on the Republican side to get up that enthusiasm, get people to the polls. And yes, it's not showing up in all of the public opinion polling, but boy, the enthusiasm is there. And we used to talk about in Virginia politics, win the urban corridor, you've got it. You can win statewide. I think the formula is changing right before our eyes in the latest 2 statewide election cycles.
If I had told you the day before the 2021 gubernatorial race that compared to when he ran the first time, Terry McAuliffe was going to do better in Fairfax, Loudoun, Prince William, Chesterfield, Henrico, and Richmond.
It's over.
And he was going to lose. You would tell me you're crazy.
Real quick detour on Chesterfield, because we've been talking so much about Northern Virginia. You just mentioned it. I mean, that was the place where there was an uptick in Democratic voting. Why? What was it about?
Well, Chesterfield's been moving a little bit to a purple county for quite some time. And right now on the Board of Supervisors, there's 3 Democrats, 2 Republicans that people haven't seen. It's the fastest growing county in Virginia right now among the large metropolitan areas. And it has basically had, I think, a lot of affluent, college-educated folks who have become the Democratic base in many places. So, for example, in the nationwide vote, of the 15 states with the highest educational attainment, the Democrats carried 14 of them. And when you start talking about Chesterfield County and Henrico County, you're talking often about high educational attainment counties. Those are the places that the Democrats are doing better. They're doing worse in the working class states, and states and counties that have larger working class populations.
Yeah.
Let me, I'm going to come back to that audience question about polls. And you were boasting about yours, Mark, and they were spot on.
Absolutely.
But, I mean, just in general, I mean, you know, I was reading so many polls in Virginia, and we saw ranges in the Senate race, for instance, that went from something like 2 points to, you know, double digits. I mean, what should voters make of that, and what should they rely on?
Well, I don't think.
Besides your poll.
Yeah,
I don't think.
Just look at our poll, we're good.
Yeah. Overall, I don't think voters should rely on polls. I
Right.
think they should do
Thank
what,
you.
regardless of their party, what Michelle Obama said, do something else.
But it frustrates them. It frustrates them
But,
when
you
they're
know,
trying to get
the
a
polls
sense of.
this time, really, many of them were
Were
right
good.
fairly on target
Absolutely.
nationally as well.
Yes.
They were saying it was a 1-point race, a 0-point race. It's going to wind up between 1 and 2 points nationally in the popular vote.
Right.
By the time all those California votes are counted. The polls in the battleground Midwest states were quite accurate, and they weren't all that, they were relatively accurate in Georgia. Where they missed was particularly Arizona and Nevada, where Trump is going to win by 5 or 6 points, and the polls had it for the most part relatively even. But the dilemma for polling, I think, is this, that there's always this margin of error that's built into it mathematically. And then compounding that is that the pollsters really have to identify who is a likely voter. And I think those that adds another dimension of uncertainty to a poll. And if you miss that, you're going to miss by a lot.
We've got about 1 minute left. A self-interested question as a journalist. Debates. Do debates matter anymore? We saw certain candidates in this cycle, winning and losing, kind of turn their backs on debates, even as early as the primary season.
Right.
And, you know, I'm wondering what you make of that.
There is not a lot of data to suggest that voters base their voting decisions on debate performance. There is not a lot of data to showcase that debates have a long-term effect on public opinion over the course of a campaign. There is a slight momentum effect after a debate, but it tends to recede after a period of time. So, of course, the first presidential debate this year was enormously important because we ended up with a different Democratic Party nominee for the presidency, but that is a huge exception to the norm regarding the importance of debates.
And I'm thinking about somebody like Hung Kao, who, again, in the primary season, avoided a lot of the forums and that sort of thing, and then, you know, rejected one of the main statewide televised debates.
Yes.
About 30 seconds
Yeah,
left.
I just said it made no sense for him to do
right.
that.
Yeah, he made a
Largely,
mistake.
he was relatively unknown.
Yeah.
He didn't have the money that Tim Kaine did, and to take and not to take advantage of free time
Right.
was really problematic. I don't think it would have mattered that much, but he should have entered those debates.
He should have been on that stage as a co-equal in that moment with the incumbent senator he's running against. The optics of that are very important.
Well, I am running right up on our deadline right now. That is all the time we have. Thanks so much for both of our panelists here, everybody here tonight. And we want to thank our sponsors, too, the Schar School of Policy and Government at George Mason University, and the signature sponsor, Walmart, and the many companies and individuals that are supporting VPAP. Thanks so much for joining us this evening. Good night.